Hey, hey, family, Pastor Ricky here, and excited again to introduce to you our speaker for the hour. We're continuing to go through a series that we call The Greatest Stories Ever Told, looking at those epic moments of the Old Testament that have shaped our hearts and our lives for our newfound faith in Christ Jesus. Today's speaker is none other than Pastor Dale Wells, who is not only a pastor, but is the newest pastor here at Southwest Church. For years, he's been serving our church in faithful ministry with our Ambassadors Ministry, a ministry to seasoned saints here at Southwest. He's been a wonderful leader and friend and colleague in the gospel. We're so excited to welcome him officially to our team and to you all as he preaches the gospel today. For decades, Dale served not only as a minister of the gospel, but also as a family court judge. He's a citizen and a servant to the public here in the Coachella Valley, a remarkable man of God, along with his bride, Mary, who've just been bright spots here at Southwest Church. He's brilliant, but he's humble. He's loving and he's kind, and this man knows God's word. Put your hands together for one of our own, Pastor Dale Wells.
Thank you so much. It is a blessing to be here with you today. I'd like you to begin with me with a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity and the ability to teach your word. Let me do so, Father, in such a way as to glorify your name, draw your people to you, draw others who are not yet your people to you. And may, Father, the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. I so much appreciate Pastor Ricky. Aren't we blessed to have him as our pastor? I've often told Mary that there are just not a lot of people I could listen to as a steady diet. But Pastor Ricky, I could listen to him every day, week in, week out, and be blessed, because he has this remarkable ability to take the text of Scripture, distill it down to the essential elements, and then present it to us in a way that it is engaging and it's memorable, and we can take it with us and we can live with it. He's just wonderful. And I hope you're praying for him this month as he and April are on their vacation, spending some time together. I hope you're especially praying for him as he's preparing for that series of lessons that he's going to preach next month. He's been telling us all along that August is coming, and he's going to be preaching a series of messages that are really going to be on socially sensitive subjects. And we need to pray for him, that as he prepares those messages, as he preaches those messages, he does so in the same gentleness and the same love with which Jesus approached that woman at the well in Samaria whose life was so messed up. And pray that the people who hear those messages are as receptive as she was. It's way too easy for us in today's world to be reactionary about the things that we hear, the things that people say. And what we need to be is receptive, to listen and pray for the listeners that hear Ricky's messages during the month of August. So please do that. I am especially gratified to see a group of people sitting here toward the back. There were about 60 seats reserved for a group that is very special to me, the Ambassadors. This is a group of people. Every Sunday morning, these folks meet upstairs in Auditorium 3 at 8 o'clock for a Bible study. Now, it's not a typical teacher droning on and on and on, giving you more and more about less and less kind of Bible study. I write a book every study, and they go through these questions about the text that we're going to look at. And the class is an interactive class where we all get to share our insights into the text. And I find it a blessing, and I think these folks find it a blessing. And if you don't mind giving up an hour of sleep on a Saturday night, you might come check us out. That's upstairs in Auditorium 3 at 8 o'clock. You've heard the saying, seeing is believing. Well, the family came home from church one day, and as families do, they talked about what happened in the service that morning. They talked about the worship songs, they talked about the prayers, they especially talked about the sermon. Well, little Johnny was in the children's ministry, and so they asked Johnny, well, what did you learn about in the children's ministry? And Johnny says, the teacher told us about how Moses led the Israelites across the Red Sea. His mother says, oh, Johnny, that's always been one of my favorite stories. How does it go? So Johnny tells the story. He says, well, Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt. He says, I don't know why. They're always talking about the children of Israel. Didn't the grown-ups ever do anything? But Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and they came to the Red Sea. And they're standing there on the shore of the Red Sea, and they look to the left, and as far as they can see is water. And they look to the right, and as far as they can see is water, and there's no way to get across the Red Sea. Then someone in back starts shouting, the Egyptians are coming, the Egyptians are coming. What are we going to do, Moses? And Moses says, it's under control, just be calm. He gets on the radio. He radios for the combat engineers to come up and build a pontoon bridge. So they build this pontoon bridge across the Red Sea, and the Israelites cross on the pontoon bridge, and they feel pretty good. They've gotten across the Red Sea. But then somebody starts shouting, the Egyptians are on the bridge. They're on the bridge. And Moses says, just be calm. Everything's on control. He gets on the radio again. He calls in a drone strike. And the drones come in and they take out the bridge. The Egyptian tanks all sink to the bottom of the Red Sea, and the Egyptians all drown. Well, you can imagine his mother. Her mouth is hanging open, her eyes are huge, and she says, Johnny, surely your teacher didn't tell you the story that way. He says, no, but you'd never believe it the way she told it. You know, the Red Sea had to be one of those, you had to see it to believe it type moments. We've all had those experiences. Every year, around Christmas and around Easter, we get a chance to look at these stories through the eyes of movie producers like Cecil B. DeMille, who wrote, about the 10 Commandments. And we get that picture of Israel crossing the Red Sea on dry ground. And it puts in our imaginations the story of what Moses and the Israelites went through. Now, there was a fellow there that day who saw it and believed it. His name was Joshua. Now, let me tell you about Joshua. Joshua is a fellow who was a slave. He was born a slave, never expected to be anything but a slave. And we don't know how old Joshua was. He's somewhere between the age of 20 and the age of 40. But we really don't know much about him except that he was a slave. His parents were slaves. His grandparents were slaves. Their parents and grandparents were slaves. In fact, for all of Joshua's history, going back maybe 10 generations, his family had been slaves. Now, slaves may hope that someday their lot will be changed, but they don't really expect it. And so Joshua really didn't have any expectation that things were going to get any better for him. And then one day, a legend came to town. This legend was a guy named Moses. Now, Moses has been on the run from the law in Egypt for longer than Joshua's been alive. So he's probably heard about him, the slave that made good and then ran afoul of the law in Egypt when he decided to stand up for the oppressed few in the slavery. And Moses has been on the run from the law for 40 years, but now he shows up and he says, things are going to change. I'm here to help you. I've got this picture in my mind of Clint Eastwood, riding into town to help the beleaguered townspeople against the mean land barons. And so Moses comes into town and things start happening, things that we know of as the plagues. I mean, water turns to blood. Then you have frogs, then gnats, then flies. Then the cattle start getting sick and dying, and then the people start getting boils all over them that just won't heal. And finally, there's a hailstorm that wipes out the crops, and what crops aren't wiped out by the hail are eaten by locusts. I mean, how much worse could things get for Egypt? Then there is an entire darkness over the land that the Bible describes as a darkness that can be felt. Have you ever experienced a darkness that can be felt? You know, last week when Larry Osborne was preaching, he talked about going down into Carlsbad Caverns when they turn the lights out. If you've ever been down in Carlsbad Caverns, when they turn the lights out, you know what a darkness that can be felt is like. You can't see your hand, even if it's just an inch in front of your face. It's absolutely, totally dark. But the strange thing about that darkness, it covered the land of Egypt, but it didn't cover Goshen, the area where the Israelites lived. Get that picture. Here you are standing 1 foot inside of Egypt. You can't see a thing. You take one step into Goshen and you're in broad daylight. That's impressive. But that wasn't the end of the plagues. Of course, we know they ended with the death of the firstborn of Egypt. All the firstborn of all the houses in Egypt died. The Israelite children were spared, and the reason that they were spared was because God had provided a substitute for them, a lamb. Just like He's provided a lamb for you and me. He provided a lamb for them. He provided a feast called Passover. And that feast was to be an annual reminder of God's deliverance from Egypt. Think about the logistics of all of this. You know, the problem with Cecil B. DeMille and some of those movie makers is their imagination's just not big enough. Here's what I mean. The book of Numbers tells us that the army of Egypt was over 600,000. That's just the men from the ages of 20 to 50. It doesn't include the old people, it doesn't include the women, it doesn't include the children, it doesn't include the entire tribe of Levi who were exempt from military service. And so with 600,000 in the army, you've got a population of 2 to 3 million people. Get the picture. Here are the Israelites. They're living on the Mediterranean coast in Goshen. And this guy shows up in town. It'd be like Moses showing up in San Diego and saying, okay, all you folks in San Diego, Chula Vista, and Carlsbad, pack up, we're moving. Where are we moving to? Oh, I thought we'd go to Death Valley. Don't you think today's a good day for me to be preaching? We're in the hottest days so far this year. Let's move to Death Valley. Okay, that'll be a nice visit. How long are we going to stay there? Well, we're going to stay there for 40 years. 40. Think about the logistics. What are you going to eat? How are you going to sustain 2 to 3 million people and their animals for 40 years in the desert? Well, God's got that covered. Every morning when they get up, on the ground, there's this stuff. They don't know what it is. In fact, that's what they call it. What is it? Parents, how would you like it if you put something on your table and your kids came in and looked at it and said, what is it? How would you like that? That's what God does. He puts it on the ground. The people say, what is it? The Hebrew word for what is it is manna. That's why we call it manna. What is it? Well, the manna, the Bible tells us, tasted like wafers made with honey. The best way I can describe this would be, the manna's kind of like the taste of a hot, fresh out of the oven, Krispy Kreme donut. Now that's worth getting up for. But it had the texture of coriander seed, which means you could take it and you could grind it, you can bake it, you can boil it, you can make it into bread, you can do all kinds of stuff. There's more ways to cook manna than there are ways to cook leftover turkey after Thanksgiving. And you just get out the Martha Stewart manna cookbook and you look in there and okay, we can have manna burritos, manna casserole, manna, maybe Dad can grill up some manna steaks. We might even find a recipe there for manicotti. And so they eat this manna every day for 40 years. And because of the way the manna comes and because of the texture and the ways they can prepare it, it's not the kind of thing that they get tired of. But it's not like Krispy Kreme donuts because it's healthy. At the end of the time they're in the desert, Moses says to the Israelites, during the 40 years that God gave you the manna, your feet didn't swell. I always wondered why he said that in Deuteronomy chapter 8. Your feet didn't swell. Have you ever seen pictures of indigenous people in cultures where they eat the same thing all the time? If you notice the pictures of the older people, the elders, you'll see that their feet and ankles are disproportionately large. That's because if you eat the same thing all the time, your body takes on water, your feet swell. And Moses says your feet didn't swell. So what he's saying is this stuff was not only tasty, but it was healthy. And so for this entire 40 years, God provided that for them. Now, Joshua was with Moses. He saw all of this. He's Moses' aide. He's also the commander of the Israeli Defense Force. Every time Israel goes to battle against somebody, it's the Amalekites or the Amorites or the Midianites, whoever it is, all those other ites, Joshua is the one who leads them into battle. He's the general of the Israeli Defense Force. And so God provides them not only the food, but he provides them water. The Bible talks about a couple of times when Moses struck a rock and water come out. Well, I've always imagined that as just a little bit of water. Somebody tells me that it would take about 11 million gallons of water to give enough water for these people every day. For those of you who went to Israel, that's about the volume of the Sea of Galilee. Well, the rabbi said what was going on here was this rock was following them, giving them water whenever they needed it. And that's what Paul says happened in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. He says, they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So even though the Old Testament doesn't tell us how exactly, Paul tells us the water was always available. So every time they set up camp, their camp would take up about the same area as Orange County. You get an idea of how big a problem we're dealing with these people in the desert. But then at the last moment, just before they're ready to enter the promised land, Moses dies. What are you going to do now? Joshua all of a sudden goes from being Moses' number 2 to being God's number 1. And God says, I'll be with you just as I was with Moses. Now, Israel's got a great psychological advantage over the Canaanites, and it's called the fear factor. Joshua sends a couple of spies into Jericho in Joshua chapter 2. They encounter a woman of ill repute. She's a prostitute. And this woman not only spares them and hides them and lies for them and helps them get out of the city undetected, but she also tells them something about the mindset of the Canaanites. Here's what she says. This is Joshua 2, verses 9 to 11. I know that the Lord has given you the land and that the fear of you has fallen upon us and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. In other words, we've been hearing for 40 years about you, and we've been hearing that you're coming. They crossed the Red Sea, they're coming this way. They defeated the Amalekites, they're coming this way. They defeated the Amorites, the Midianites, the Moabites, and all those other ites, they're coming this way. They're now across the Jordan River, just on the east side, where Jericho's just on the west side, and for 40 years the people have been terrified. And what they know as a fact is Israel's God is the only true God. But what they're not willing to do is submit to him. But Rahab's different. Rahab submits to him. And because of that, the spies promise that when the city is taken, she'll be spared. So they have that fear factor. Now, Jericho is a strategic place. It's situated just on the west side of the Jordan River, just above the Dead Sea. It's the entrance into the land. You can't get into to Canaan, the promised land, without going through or around Jericho. And they can't afford to go around it because that just leaves the enemy behind them as they're taking the land. Not only that, but Jericho's situated at the entrance to the two routes into the land that Israelites are going to use when they conquer Canaan. So they have to deal with Jericho. But Jericho's really not that big an obstacle. It's a small town. The whole city of Jericho is only about 9 acres. About 6 acres on the upper city, about 3 acres on the lower city. And it's not that big. Even as much as they crowded people into cities back in the Bronze Age, you couldn't get more than 2,000 or 3,000 people in the city. And Israel's got an army of 600,000, 200 times as large as the population of Jericho. It's really not that big a city. As a matter of fact, those of you who went to Israel, we drove right past it. You may have noticed if you were sitting up close to the bus that I was on that Hillick and I, our tour guide and I, were talking as we went through Jericho. And I looked over to the left, and just across the fence was a mound. And I said, "That is Tel Es Sultan, isn't it?" He said, "Yes, it is." Tel Es Sultan is the archaeological name for the Bronze Age city of Jericho that was defeated by Joshua here in Joshua chapter 6. We were right by it, just as that road, this road right here, passes right along by the city of Jericho. That's just a superimposition of what the city would have looked like in the 14th century BC. But Jericho is a difficult city to take because it's fortified. As a matter of fact, Jericho is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. The second is Damascus, Syria. But Jericho is fortified. It's also the first city in the world with fortified walls like it had. Around the outside of the city, there was a ditch 15 feet deep. Just inside the ditch, there was a revetment wall. That's a wall that's designed to keep people from getting right under the wall and using ladders to scale it. It keeps the enemy far enough from the wall that the archers on top of the wall can deal with them. And then there was a wall that was 23 feet high from that. You go inside the city, there was an inner wall. You notice in Joshua 5 verse 1, it talks about the city was shut up inside and outside. That's because of 2 walls. And so this is the way the city looks. And Joshua's scratching his head. How are we going to take a city like that? The Israelites don't have any experience with siege warfare. They don't have catapults, they don't have siege towers, they don't have battering rams, they don't have scaling ladders, they don't have any of those things with them. They just simply don't have any experience. So Joshua's wondering, how am I going to deal with this? He wants to take it, but doesn't know what to do quite yet. Now let's pause for a word from our sponsor. Before Jericho is taken by Israel, there are some matters that need to be taken care of by Israel, and they fall into the category of consecration comes before conquest. Consecration comes before conquest. There are some things that Israel has neglected for the last 40 years that are important things. For one thing, they've neglected this thing called circumcision. Now, guys, let's be honest. That would be one we'd be glad to forget. But it's a totally different thing to circumcise an 8-day-old infant like they were supposed to than it is to circumcise a grown male. Totally different. But if we all had a chance to take a vote on it, we'd vote to pass, so we can understand why the people have neglected circumcision. But in Joshua 5, verses 2 to 9, we're told that the Israelites who came out of Egypt, they had been circumcised. Those who were born in the desert had not been circumcised. Well, what does that mean? Circumcision was the mark that tied them back to Abraham and God's promise to him. Back in Genesis chapter 17, God said to Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to be a blessing to all the world. And the mark of that covenant's going to be every male in your family is to be circumcised. And he goes on and says, anyone who's not circumcised is to be cut off from the people. All the time the Israelites are in the desert, they haven't circumcised that entire next generation. So, have you ever noticed how we always want God to do things for us, but we never ask what he wants of us? And so Joshua says we got to deal with this matter of circumcision, getting right with the covenant. Remember, the generation that goes into the promised land is not the same generation that came out of Egypt. The baby boomers who came out of Egypt, they all died in the desert. The people who are going into the promised land are their children and grandchildren, the millennials, generations X, Y, and Z. They're the ones who are inheriting the land. And they hadn't been circumcised because their parents had been unfaithful. Now that's a risky proposition. Here is Israel now on the west side of the Jordan. They've crossed over on dry ground, which had to strike terror in the hearts of Jericho. And they're camped within eyesight, within a mile or two of Jericho itself. And while they're camped there, the first thing they're going to do is totally disable their army. Doesn't that sound a little bit risky? I mean, if you remember, the Israelites, they have a history of that. Back in Genesis 34, there was that story about when Jacob and his sons moved to the area around Shechem, and the people in Shechem wanted to intermarry and live with the Canaanites or the Israelites. And so they said, what can we do so that we can intermarry with you? And Jacob's sons said, tell you what, we can't do it unless you're all circumcised. And so all the men of the city get circumcised. Now, can you imagine the sales job that Shechem and Hamor had to do to make that happen? And so while the men are all recovering from that, Simeon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, go in and slaughter them all. Now Israel is exposing themselves to the same kind of possibility. What's to keep the people of Jericho from coming out and attacking them? So by being circumcised right in eyesight of Jericho, what they're doing is they're showing their trust in God that he could spare them. The second thing they hadn't done for 40 years is Passover. They'd celebrated Passover before. Back in Exodus chapter 12, there was the Passover at Egypt just before they came out of Egypt and their slavery. Then a year later, they celebrated Passover at Mount Sinai. Numbers chapter 9 tells us about that. But after that, for the next 39 years, they had not observed Passover. It's supposed to be an annual observance. But you know, people who are in the desert, who know they're not going to get into promised land, who are disappointed and discouraged, well, they're not really particularly interested in religious ceremonies, and so they don't observe the Passover. Now, what that means is this. This is the third Passover Israel has ever celebrated. The first two were 40 years ago and 39 years ago, respectively. Anyone under the age of 40 has never seen a Passover. And in the land, they observe a Passover, and then things start happening. They go from manna to the Mediterranean diet. As soon as they've completed the circumcision, as soon as they've completed the Passover, the manna stops and they eat the fruit of the land. Here's what the Bible says. The day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain, and the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. What's the fruit of the land? Well, Moses had described it back in Deuteronomy chapter 8. It includes things like wheat and barley and vines and figs and pomegranates and olives and honey. It's a land in which you'll eat bread without scarcity. They have everything you could possibly want or need, and they're now eating the fruit of the land that they themselves didn't plant, didn't till, didn't cultivate. And that's when Joshua met Jesus. Consecration comes before conquest. The next scene opens up with Joshua doing recon of Jericho. He's going around the city trying to decide how it is that we're going to take this city. And he meets a stranger. And here's our text. You wondered if I ever get to it, didn't you? When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out, none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor." So, Joshua meets this stranger. Doesn't know who he is. Looks like a soldier, dressed like a soldier, carrying his sword, has it out, ready to fight. Joshua wants to know who he's going to fight. Are you a friend or foe? I mean, that's what we want to know, isn't it? Whose side are you on? And so that's what Joshua asks. Are you for us or are you for our adversaries? I love the answer. No. I can't tell you how many times in court people would ask a question and the answer they got didn't tell me anything more than I knew before the question was asked. There's an art to asking questions. So here are two choices. Choice A, choice B. You for us, you for our adversaries? No. What does that mean? Well, some of the translations kind of smooth it out. They say neither. I'm not for you, I'm not for your adversaries. That's not what the Hebrew text says. It just says no. In other words, what this guy is saying is, Joshua, you're asking the wrong question. The question is not, am I for you or your adversaries? The question is not which side I'm on. The question is which side you're on. Because I came as the commander of the Lord's army. I didn't come to take sides. I came to take charge. And so he says, and I love this also, at the end he says, now I have come. What does that mean, now I have come? Here's what I think it means. Now, you've gotten right with God. You've got circumcision, you've got the Passover, you've done everything God has expected of you that you haven't been doing for 40 years. You're in the promised land, consecration's taken place. Now let's get to the business of conquest. Now I have come. But Joshua figures out pretty quickly that this is more than a man. In fact, he's more than an angel. Because you notice in verse 14, it says Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped. Now, you don't worship a man. Joshua knows that. You don't even worship an angel. Every time in the Bible you come across a person who comes across an angel and bows down before that angel, every time, what does the angel say? Get up, I'm a servant just like you. Worship God. So Joshua knows he's more than a man, but we find out that he's more than an angel. Notice the next line. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. Not only does he accept worship, he commands worship. Now, Joshua's heard the story about this from 40 years ago, because there was another fellow who got called and who was told to take off his shoes because he was standing on holy ground. And that was his mentor. Joshua is the protege of Moses, remember? Moses was called that way. He comes across a bush that appears to be burning, but it's not consumed. He wants to know, who is this? What's going on? And the voice says, take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. And then he identifies himself as none other than Yahweh, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Now Joshua has the same experience. Take off your sandals from your feet. The place you're standing is holy. That's like saying, I am God. And if we didn't get it from there, we get it from chapter 6, verse 2. The Lord said to Joshua. Notice in your Bibles, Lord is in all caps. Whenever you come across the word Lord in all caps, that's a place where in the Hebrew text, you've got the name of God, Yahweh, Jehovah. And so what looks like a man, maybe an angel. No, it's not an angel. It is none other than the Lord himself. The reason I say when Yeshua met Yeshua is this. When we were driving through Israel, when we were in Galilee, our tour guide named Hillick was always talking about Yeshua. In Galilee, Yeshua lived at Nazareth. Yeshua lived at Capernaum. You know, we talked about at Migdal or Magdala, where we stayed in that hotel, where they had found a first century synagogue. Yeshua taught here. He's always talking about Jesus. The Hebrew name for Jesus is Yeshua. But the Hebrew name for Joshua is also Yeshua. So this is where Yeshua met Yeshua. What are some lessons Joshua learned from this experience? Well, first thing he learned is he's not alone. He sees a man when he's doing recon of the city. The second thing he learned was he's not in charge. This man comes as commander of the Lord's army. The third thing he learned was he's standing on holy ground. Wait a minute, I thought I was in this godless city, in this godless territory, but you're telling me it's holy ground? And then finally, he learned that his victory was assured. Now think about that. You and I all have our Jerichos. We all face our obstacles in life where we really don't know where to turn, we really don't know what to do, and we need to know the same things that Joshua needed to know here. You might say, well, Joshua had 3 million Jews with him. He's got to be okay. But I'm not talking about that. There's something to be said for having a large group of people who can commiserate with you. But what's more important is Joshua learns the Lord is with him. And so we're never alone if the Lord is with us. In 1990, Bette Midler wrote or sang a song. The song is From a Distance, and it says, God is watching us from a distance. Well, the good news of Joshua chapter 5 is God's not watching us from a distance. He's intimately involved in us when we face our obstacles, when we encounter our Jerichos. We have the one who calls in the Bible Emmanuel, God with us. The one who says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. The one who says, I'm with you always to the end of the world. We can count on him. He's there with us in our struggle. The second thing Joshua learns is we're not in charge. Isn't that a relief to know that I'm not responsible for what happens? I'm not the one in charge. The Lord always comes to us in the way we need him. When he came to Abraham in Genesis 18, he came as a traveler. When he came to the disciples in the Gospels, he came as a carpenter with a bunch of fishermen. When he comes to Joshua, he comes as a soldier. Why? Because Joshua needed a soldier with him right there. The Lord is in charge, and our only responsibility is to submit to him. It's not a question of whether God's on your side. The question is whether you're on God's side. In 1864, right at the height of the Civil War, less than 1 year before he was assassinated, a man named F.B. Carpenter spent 6 months with Abraham Lincoln. He wrote a monograph about it a little later. I'd heard this story but never could find it. I finally found it yesterday. The monograph is called 6 Months at the White House with Abraham Lincoln. On page 282, he tells this story. He says, a clergyman came to President Lincoln in the height of the Civil War and said, I hope the Lord is on our side. Here's Lincoln's response. I am not at all concerned about that, for I know that the Lord is always on the side of the right. But it is my constant anxiety and prayer that I and this nation should be on the Lord's side. We got to avoid the trap of assuming that God's on our side or the other guy's side. We got to avoid the trap of assuming that God votes red or votes blue, that God's for this team or that team, that God cares who wins the Super Bowl or he cares who wins the World Series. He may have an opinion on the Calder Cup. I don't know. But it's a great day in the life of a person when we learn that we're not in charge. Tim Keller says in 1970, he died a few weeks ago. In 1970, he says a teacher gave him an illustration that changed his life. He said, if you were to assume that the 92 million miles that separates the earth from the sun was reduced to the thickness of paper, then the distance between the earth and the nearest star would be a stack of papers 70 feet high. The diameter of the galaxy would be a stack of papers 310 miles high. The galaxy is just a speck of dust in the universe, yet Jesus holds the universe together by the word of his power. And finally, the teacher says, now is this the kind of person you want to ask to come into your life as your assistant? You've seen the bumper stickers. God is my co-pilot. Let me tell you, if God's your co-pilot, he's sitting in the wrong seat. He didn't come to assist, he came to take charge. Wherever we submit to God, we're standing on holy ground. Think about this. For years, God's held back his judgment from Canaan because he said back in Genesis chapter 15, their sin hasn't gotten as bad as it's going to get. I mean, this is a place that's full of immorality, idolatry, all kinds of depravity going on in Canaan. But what I learn here is if Canaan can be holy ground, then wherever God calls you and me, that's holy ground. That means the Coachella Valley is our holy ground. With its gangs, with its drugs, with its human trafficking, with the crime, with the poverty, with the homelessness, all the bad stuff around us, this is where God's called us, so that means this is our holy ground. You're standing on holy ground. Did you know that? And the only proper response to meeting the Lord on holy ground is worship. Finally, we need to learn we don't fight for victory, we fight from victory. Our victory is assured. I love the way Joshua 6 verse 2 is written. Before Israel's ever marched around Jericho that first time, before the trumpets have sounded and the walls have fallen down, before all of that, God says to Joshua, I have given Jericho into your hand. It's in a tense called the perfect tense. The perfect tense is something that's established by something happened in the past and it makes the future certain. There's no doubt who's going to win this battle because God has already decreed Jericho is going to fall. We don't fight for victory, we fight from victory. So what we need to know is our public victories all come as the result of private visits with the Lord. What's your Jericho? Is your Jericho family dysfunction or codependency or physical or emotional or sexual abuse or chemical dependency, substance abuse, some addiction, maybe sex or pornography? Are you struggling with mental health? Do you suffer with PTSD? Do you have to deal with anger? What's your Jericho? The thing you need to remember is you're not alone. You're not in charge. You're standing on holy ground even when you're going through that struggle, and your victory is assured. But I want to leave you with one last thing. And that is that God is the God of restoration. You should never end a lesson without some good news. And here's the good news. God is the God of restoration. You recall in Joshua chapter 2 when they sent the spies into the land and they encountered that one woman out of an entire city who submitted to the Lord and they promised they'd spare her. Well, when the city is destroyed, Joshua sends the spies back into the land to bring her out. They bring her out, the land is destroyed, but Rahab and her family, they come out and they live with the Israelites to the day that the book of Joshua was written. It's a great story, isn't it? Out of all that wicked city, God was able to save one person. But there's more to it than that. Because when you get to Matthew chapter 1, and Matthew gives us the genealogy of Jesus himself, her name's one of the names you see there. Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. So apparently Salmon was one of the spies. He married Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. Now you've got two foreigners, one with a bad reputation, one with a good reputation. Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of David, the king. So when Jesus had Joshua spare that woman, what he did is he spared David's great-great-grandmother and his own 16 times great-grandmother. Jesus is able to destroy the wicked and spare those who give their faith to him at the same time. There's good news if you're fighting against Jericho in your life. The main thing we need to remember, the real question is not whose side is God on, but whose side am I on? Whose side are you on? Stand. Lift your hands and receive God's blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon each and every one of you and give you his peace. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in the blessing of God.